I wish to address the issue of this gentleman. He is my servant, and I am here to pay the debt against him.
It's so late.
Hello, and welcome to the next installment of the making of this dress from 1998's Ever After film. Completed in the first 3 videos of this series were the shift, or camicia in Italian, an underdress with a structured bodice, and then also the sleeves. If you missed out on any of those videos, I created a playlist for this project if you're interested. Now let's take a closer look at the final piece of this outfit. The overdress is made of a green gold floral fabric with gold trim and an overlapping front design. Most of the skirt pleating is focused on the back half, and the dress closes with lacing in the back. The length of the skirt is a bit trained in the back, longer than the underskirt. Patterning for this overgown is pretty simple. I will be using view 5 from the period patterns number 41 again, just like the sleeves and the skirt of the underdress. And of course, the first thing that we're going to start with is making a mock-up. And I found just the most perfect scrap of fabric for this.
Here goes nothing. Oh, shoot. Oops. Probably want to sew up those shoulder seams. Oops. All right, try number 2. Real good. Yeah, not quite.
This is the hardest part of projects for me, figuring out where to add to the pattern when I need to enlarge a garment. The bottom edge needed to be lengthened for sure, and I also needed to let out the back and the side seams to allow the front pieces to overlap enough to match the design in the movie. I made my amendments to the pattern by sort of holding up a piece of paper. I suppose I could have just measured and wrote it down, but I just wanted to make sure I got that angle right on the front. And I made the amendments to the pattern, cutting out each pattern piece again with my trusty wrapping paper, which is almost running out, which will be a very sad day.
Try number 2.
The second mock-up had an extra inch of width in the back and a half an inch on each side, and the fit was pretty perfect.
So I've been having to think about how I want to go about constructing this, and I think what I'm gonna do is, so in the pattern the front is meant to meet up with like a clasp or something, and the back is supposed to be cut on the fold, but in the film it's laced in the back and the fronts overlap a bit, which is how I adjusted it to give me enough to overlap. So I think what I'm gonna do is, it's gonna be constructed as 2 separate pieces, and I'm gonna cut out the pattern pieces for the lining and the outer fabric, which is this beauty. And then I'm going to sew the 2 side seams and the shoulder seams, and then I'm going to just stitch along the edges of the lining and the outer fabric, so I can flip it inside out and have all finished edges around the outer, and I'll deal with the arm's eye later. And then those finished edges can just be sewn together here, and then I'll sew in a boning channel. I guess I'll need to do that first, because in the film it does look like there is boning channels to hold the eyelets nice and, you know, straight. So, I'm trying to think how I can get the boning channels in there if I'm gonna finish both of the edges. I guess I can just hand stitch, or, oh, I guess the bone can come in through the arms, and then I can push it up to the side and then just run a stitch down. Yeah, that'll work fine. So the fabric for the outside is going to be, this is not silk. This is a 100% cotton from Renaissance Fabrics. It's got this embossed pattern on it, and it's got some sheen to it. So I thought it would stand in okay for brocade. And, oh, I still don't have, okay, I'm trying to get just one. It is pretty, it's not like denim or anything. Like, it kind of looks like it would be, like when it's all folded on top, it's like, man, that's gonna be way too thick, but I think it will have a nice drape and will look very nice. So that's the outer, and then for the inner is just more linen that I overbought. This is just the medium weight that I made the shift out of, that I made the lining of the underdress, and now will be the lining of this one.
With the pattern all figured out, I started by cutting the lining, and I also cut the outer fabric pattern pieces, and this took a little more finessing. I wanted the patterns to mirror each other on each side of the front and the back, and since the print is large, I wanted to center one of the flower pomegranate designs in the center of each front piece. So in order to do this, I needed to line up the patterns on both parts of the fabric, which is what I'm doing now, so that when I cut out both at the same time, it will be mirror images of each other. Next, I stitched up all of the side seams and pressed the seams flat. The lining and the outer fabric were then lined up right side to right side and pinned all the way around for the next step. Once it was all pinned, each half was then stitched all the way around without leaving a gap for turning out, because the armhole will allow for that. I did think about top stitching along these edges once they were turned out, but I realized I'll be sewing trim on later, so I skipped that for now. I used my last two leftover zip ties from my 18th Century Stays project, and I cut them to size and rounded the edges. After trying it on, I could see that the bodice was going to be a bit short, and I hoped that the skirts would help pull it down with the weight. And the shoulder would definitely need trimming thinner, but I had known that in the film they are super thin straps, and this pattern has much thicker ones, but the edges are unfinished, so that wasn't going to be a problem to just trim those down. I hand stitched the boning channels down using some embroidery floss that just so happened to be the exact color of this fabric that was left over from the Scottish thistles I embroidered on my stomacher. And I did it by hand because I don't have a zipper foot, and I was way too afraid to sew through it with my machine. The skirt panels ended up being too wide to cut the fabric while it was folded in half. And I did have a 5-minute panic attack where I thought I wouldn't have enough fabric, and Renaissance Fabrics was out of this color. But after measuring, I found out that I did have enough, thank goodness. I did make sure to pay attention to the fabric direction to make sure the pattern was right side up. Then the back seam was sewn first, leaving a gap at the top for putting the dress on. This seam is made up of 2 selvage edges, so it is done, no more finishing needed. And for the side seams that were next, because I'm super lazy, of course I decided to French seam them because I will do anything to avoid hand felling seams. To finish off the front edges that will hang open, I ironed the selvage edges over 1/4 of an inch for later hand finishing. For the first time, I'm actually going to pleat this skirt by eye and not calculate anything. The front has only 2 pleats on each side near the center of the bodice and nothing else. I did end up having to adjust them later to spread them out a little bit farther, but other than that, the front went pretty okay. You can see the adjustment I made on the left side to make it more like the film with the bigger space there than on the right. For the back of the skirt, I split the remainder in half to help get even pleats. And of course I pleated too densely the first time and had to redo some of it. Each half needed to be 5.5 inches when it was fully pleated, so that's what I was using as my guide for each half. I tried to make a point to hide the side seams and make sure that there were double pleats sat on top of the back opening to help it fill out the gap where it'll be laced up. I basted the pleats in place and I also zigzagged the edges, which is all I'm going to do to finish off this raw edge. This fabric doesn't fray too bad, so I'm really not worried about it. So I pinned on the skirt to the bodice just to sort of see where everything would match up and kind of eyeball, like I think that's definitely a big enough opening that I left. I have the boning channels sort of safety pinned together for now. But I think the back is looking good. And can I do this one-handed? Flipping it around. I do think the pleats maybe come a little bit too far, but I think I need to scoot this over because it needs to be more like here, and then that will shift that around and I can just add an extra pleat like in the back somewhere over here. This is my first time ever working with piping, and to start the piped seam, I pinned it to the right side of the bodice as close to the edge as possible to preserve the length that was already too short. I found I had a piping foot that I didn't know about that has a groove in the bottom which lets you sew over the piping and adjust the needle position to sew right where the edge of the piping is. This stitch line you make with these first basting stitches on the inside of the bodice will act as a guide when you're sewing the 2 halves of the dress together. So you want to make this stitch as close as possible to that edge of the piping. I pinned the skirt onto the bodice with enough seam allowance that I'll be able to iron it flat and won't have to remove any of the basting stitches. Now I did the carefulest, slowest stitching I have ever done in my life, trying to follow exactly on the previous stitch line. And this was white thread on white fabric, which is probably not the smartest move in my book. I probably should have used something contrasting, but luckily the piping is still under that groove. It just has other layers on top of it, so it's not as locked into that groove under the foot, but it does help keep it in a nice straight line. I thought it would record in real time whether this worked or not. The piping should be just on the other side. I stitched right on top of the same stitch line. I'm so nervous. Oh god, I think it went okay. Oh, let me take that pin out. Ah! I freaking did it! Oh my god. Okay, well, it's not like the most perfect. You can see some of the white, but I am so happy with that. Oh my god. Yes. Yay. This thread I'm about to use that I stole from my mom says West Germany on it, so I think it's a little old. But I was fed up with hand sewing from the sleeves that I decided I was going to try to use this old thread to sew on my trim by machine. And it worked out okay. I wasn't having any problems with the thread breaking all the time. So I just pinned on the trim that is from the same Etsy shop as the trim on the sleeves, so they match perfectly. This one's just a thinner version. And I sewed right down the center, which is also gonna hold that turned edge of the bodice nice and flat. So it's basically like top stitching and putting the trim on at the same time. For the shoulder edges, I couldn't make them as thin as the movie because they need to cover up the underdress straps, which I made pretty thick to help them support the dress. So they can't be how they should be. So instead, I just took off just a little bit of the fabric to make it sit right on the edge of my shoulder nicely. To finish off the edges of the shoulders, I decided to just fold in the edges, turn both the lining and the outside in and iron that in place, and then just simply top stitch along the outside. This stitching will be covered up by trim anyway, so I don't really have a problem with machine stitching just showing right on the front. For the closure in the back, I decided to make my eyelets in a spiral pattern to match more of the portraiture of the period and try to be a little bit more accurate than the cross lacing in the film. This is just tied with a pink ribbon for now. And this is the final bodice with all of the trim placed on. Now we come to my least favorite part of every project ever, which is hemming. I hate putting in a hem, but I did my usual method where I pinned up what I just thought would be okay and then tried on the whole outfit to make sure that it was even and that the underdress wasn't showing out underneath the overgown. And once I got that and that was okay, then I pressed in the actual hem with the turned under edge that I will then herringbone stitch. And here's some shots of it all put together. Right now it's just, I can't tie it on myself and I live alone, so I can't actually close it up. I'm just holding it closed. And here's some side by side with the film. And if you're worried that this is a very anticlimactic reveal, it sort of is. I can't go anywhere and I'm stuck in my apartment alone, but I do have plans to take some real footage of this. So keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks for another video finishing off this entire project. Thank you for watching this video, especially if you're one of the people who has seen all the videos of this series. This has been so much fun to make.